you actually need like mountaineers to build the path in the first place, more or
They are
less.
people who are specially trained in climbing, but they would also themselves be engineer trained. So it was a combination of those two. You can get people who can do climbing and you can get engineers, but you actually have to somebody who can do both.
They're few and far between, I would imagine.
They are, yes.
And your own family goes back there a few generations.
A few generations, about 300 or so. Anyway,
What will you say? You're not really a Glens
You're not
person.
really a Glens person. You haven't roots in the Glen for going back 300 years.
300 years. And that's the truth, isn't it? There's lots of families here.
Oh, there is.
Isostatic rebound. I learnt that phrase very recently, and that's where the land's coming back up again. Is not the case?
There you are. You don't need me to tell you this.
I just learnt that off, and I didn't think there's any point in learning it off. You're not going to use it in conversation.
And here you are with it.
Round about 13,000 years ago, when the Ice Age decided that things were hotting up in Ireland and it was time to retreat further north, this is one of the last places it would have lingered before quitting the country for good. So by that stage, it would have perfected one of the signature skills that ensured we would forever remember its visit here: the creation of the U-shaped valley. This is its masterpiece, the largest and, in the opinion of many, the most beautiful of them all. Welcome to the Queen of the Glens, to Glenariff on the east coast of County Antrim. The name Glenariff translates into English as the Glen of Arable Land, and indeed the Queen of the Glens cradles within her outstretched arms a fertile valley which grows in confidence and width as it approaches the sandy beach at Red Bay. At the Queen's feet, gazing across the sea at the Mull of Kintyre on the Scottish shore, sits the aptly named village of Waterfalls, a thin white ribbon of human habitation where the Antrim coast road takes a breather before plunging headlong into further adventures beyond the portal of the Red Arch. Red Bay is bracketed not only by those sculpted cliff-topped braes, but also by relics of Antrim's often turbulent and multi-layered history: maritime, military, ecclesiastical and industrial. All worthy of exploration and all on my list of places to visit before I leave the glens of Antrim. But I want to begin my journey of exploration further inland and further upland, deep among the high-timbered banks where Glenariff itself is anything but arable, still in primeval mode and shrouded in mists of its own making, as thunderous falls of white water hurl themselves against obdurate walls of black basalt. Incessant cataracts churn up ever-deepening cauldrons, and endless eddies pass the time by creating perfectly circular doodles of foam that could spin forever in the backwater. It's a dramatic and energizing natural spectacle that quickens the heartbeat and lures us into cautious proximity. But only the very agile or intrepid could penetrate these deepest gorges were it not for leisured Victorian romantics who insisted on the near impossible construction of pathways into the very heart of nature. Even a lifetime of forestry management has not left Mark Parker immune to the charms of Glenariff's cascades, but he has inherited the formidable task of ensuring that these pathways continue to provide access for all, even now on one of the shortest days of midwinter. It gives you a marvellous opportunity to come into a place that otherwise would be practically impossible, inaccessible to get to. But you were telling me that this structure here is actually sort of a descendant of a late Victorian structure, that they put the first pathway in here.
That's my understanding, that the late Victorians created a walkway. They created several footpaths and walkways and crossing points on the river. They were very much into getting people out and getting them to look at the natural landscape. But the walkways that we have here today are of more recent construction, but they replicate what would have been here previously.
It's easy to see why, Mark, this was such an attraction. In fact, it's still a big tourist attraction. You were saying it's some sort of top 10 list somewhere recently about best places to walk.
That's right. A few years ago, the Financial Times published a list of the top 10 winter walks to be had across the UK, and this was featured. And I think
winter walks?
A winter walk, yes. And I think it is worth pointing out that it is a very much of an international draw here. People actually come here specifically because of this waterfall walks. They're coming to the north coast, but they actually make this a stopping off point.
The waterfall behind us now is only one of a whole sequence of waterfalls.
Yeah.
We passed a number of others. Is this the biggest, the most
Well,
spectacular?
yes,
of
it
them?
would be the tallest, but it's not my personal favourite. There's another one down at the bottom, which is in Gaelic it's called Esna Crub, but it's also known locally as the Horseshoe Falls. And it's a very attractive horseshoe feature. So, but the whole sort of series of waterfalls all adds together to make a wonderful experience. But it can be just very, very hard to hear. It's quite noisy today, but other times you really wouldn't hear yourself think here.
Yeah, but I think there's a twofold kind of reaction to waterfalls. One is that they're loud, so you kind of have to raise your voice a wee bit.
Yep.
But I also think there's a kind of a bit of a fizz in the air.
Oh, yeah.
You know, all these negative
There is.
ions, and we tend to get a bit excited about it all. You know, a wee bit of adrenaline or something like that.
Yeah.
But maybe that's why we're attracted to waterfalls in the first place.
I think so.
But
My children used to call this the Coca-Cola River whenever they were younger.
Because of the colour of the
Yeah,
water. Back to the pathways. If you wanted to build this from scratch today, you probably wouldn't be allowed.
Well, you wouldn't know. I mean, the statutory designation on this ASSI would actually prohibit this type of a structure if this was being proposed now as a totally new build,
Right.
which obviously we're not. But we maintain what's here, but it is very difficult to maintain it. 3 years ago, when the heavy snows came to North Antrim, this area was very badly damaged. It wasn't the snow itself that damaged the boardwalk, but because the landscape and the ground beside the rock is so loose in places, the trees came down, there was a lot of rockfall, a lot of damage with physical pieces of timber coming down.
Was this the weight of the snow? or-
Yes, the weight of the snow brought them down, and it was combined with a very strong wind too. So you
Right.
actually had a serious snowstorm. The other thing being too that there was timber that fell into the river upstream and then was washed down here. So one of the most damaging effects was actually a large tree trunk that came right down the waterfall behind us and smashed in below us here. So all this,
And knock those props away.
actually, this here was completely bent. The steel girders were bent double.
Good Lord.
The underwashing that was done with the concrete supports, all had to be replaced.
But in a way as well, I mean, it's primeval in more ways than one, because of the nature of this landscape here, you can't possibly get heavy machinery or
No.
lorries or anything of that nature in here.
No.
So any repairs that you have to are forced to carry out.
Very much
Really
done by
all
hand.
done with basic tools as
Yes.
well. Is that right?
It is either done by hand or by tools that can be lifted in by hand. Everything had to be, whenever we did the repairs here 3 years ago, everything had to be brought in by hand. There was no machinery brought in here that was, no road going machinery at all.
I mean, where do you actually stand to repair?
Well, you don't.
Concrete block with those big.
You don't. In the rock face above, you will find as you go up, there is actually metal rings drilled right into the rock face. Those are for the climbers.
So you actually need like mountaineers to build the path in the first place, more or
They are
less.
people who are specially trained in climbing, but they would also themselves be engineer trained. So it was a combination of those two. You can get people who can do climbing and you can get engineers, but you actually have to have somebody who can do both.
They're few and far between, I would imagine.
They are, yes.
Yeah.
But the gentleman that I met who was doing this particular repair here was very happy, even though he was dangling backwards and the river in full flow below him, and he had no worries about it at all.
My admiration for such exploits is right up there alongside my sense of wonder at those Victorian navvies who were sent into such a trackless gorge to build that first boardwalk over 100 years ago. When the youthful and exuberant Glenariff River reaches the valley floor, it will quickly abandon its wild ways and assume an attitude of mature reflection as it flows calmly under the bridge at Waterfoot Village to seep into the sea at Red Bay. Just across the road from the beach at Red Bay, you'll find what some local people still refer to as coves, a description that harkens back to their origin. They are in fact sea caves, gouged out of the red sandstone cliff face before the raised beach and the modern road cut them off from their creator. Coves or caves, they provided in centuries past, for those who perhaps didn't have another option, a roof over their heads. The term cave dwellers is often used in a derogatory way to suggest people who are uncultivated or have a primitive outlook on life. But the people who inhabited the caves at Red Bay in past centuries were some of the cleverest people in the country, because this is where the local hedge school was located. And the standard of basic education available at such hedge schools must have been of a very high order, because they produced some of the finest scholars of the age. One prominent example was James MacDonald, who was born in these parts in 1763 and attended the Red Bay Head School as his first step up the academic ladder. When he graduated from his cave, he went on to study in Belfast and Edinburgh, and he qualified as a doctor in 1788. Among his many achievements was the setting up of the Belfast Dispensary and Fever Hospital for the Poor, which became eventually, after more than a century and a few changes of address, the Royal Victoria Hospital. Another famous actual cave dweller in the real sense was a woman called Anne Murray, who lived up to the age of 100 in what became known as Nanny's Cave. And she was no slouch in the brain department either. She was renowned as a potsheen maker, but it would have been against the law, of course, for her to sell it, so she didn't. Instead, she eked out her living by selling visitors a drink of water. But with every drink of water you bought, you got a free glass of potsheen. And less of a hangover next morning, presumably. Anne Murray lived and died in her cave at Red Bay, but Dr. James MacDonald became a major figure in 18th and 19th century Belfast, not only in the field of medicine, but also in the cultural life of the city, having been instrumental in setting up the Belfast Harp Festival in 1792 and the Belfast Reading Society, a precursor of the Linen Hall Library. James MacDonald, a native of Cushendall, never forgot his roots and is buried in the Old Glade churchyard nearby. It's a wonderfully atmospheric location overlooking the sea, a fitting final resting place for a descendant of the MacDonald chieftains, of whom a great deal more when we come back. This is all that remains of Red Bay Castle. Though it's in a thoroughly ruined state, it still seems to manage to cling to vestiges of its former grandeur and pride, due mostly to the fact that it stands high on a promontory between Cushendall and Waterfoot, overlooking Red Bay and the base of Glenariff. The name MacDonald is pretty much synonymous with the glens of Antrim, and it was another James MacDonald who built his castle here in the year 1561. But of course, given the advantages of a site such as this, you'd have to assume that he wasn't by any means the first to erect some kind of fortification here. Yes, this promontory has a long and complicated history, but no better man to summarise that history than my companion Donald O'Lone, whose encyclopedic knowledge of the glens takes us back at least 1,000 years before James MacDonald laid the first stone here. As I said to you on the way up this wee bank down here, I wouldn't like to be running up there carrying a battle axe or a weapon of any sort, because well, it is defensive, isn't it? That was the whole reason.
It is defensive, and that's the whole reason why that is there. And it's probably been a defensive fort for quite a long time.
But long before this castle was built.
Long before this time. Before
How
it
long
was
are you
built.
talking about?
Well, the Gaelic name for where we're standing, this site, is Cruachanavik, which means hill of the viewpoint. And I think that takes us back right into Gaelic-speaking times, right back to the kingdom of Dalriada.
You're talking 1,500 years?
1,500 years ago,
probably.
indeed.
Right,
yes.
Right. And the view includes, of course, as we were saying earlier on, right across to Scotland.
It does, and of course the kingdom of Dalriada existed here in North Antrim and Western Scotland, and became much more important in Western Scotland and gradually declined here.
Right.
So it was followed here then by the Utertra, the O'Flynn's, who would also have used this as a fort.
That mound, as I call it, it's likened to the Motte and Bailey structure that the Normans brought in, of course, isn't it?
Yes, the O'Flynn's learned from the Normans, and they in fact built similar castles to the Normans in the Motte and Bailey style.
Okay.
But around the middle 1200s then, real Normans arrived here, and that was the Bissets, who had been expelled from Scotland. They were supposed to go to the Holy Land, but as I say, they turned right instead of left, and they came here, where they bought...
With a bit of a cloud hanging over their head, is that the story as well?
Oh yes, indeed. They had murdered their uncle Alan de Galloway,
right.
And so they were supposed to go to the Holy Land and do penance. It was no penance to come here, but they came here.
Depends on the weather, of course.
Oh, yes, it does.
But they came here then, the Bissets came here, what, 1200s around that time?
Middle 1200s,
Middle
yes.
1200s. So they would have had a structure, a castle of some sort here as well.
Yes, that's the first recorded history, really, of this, that the Bissets, although the Flynns still existed here, but they seem to have coexisted pretty well with the Bissets.
Right.
And the story is that the Bissets built the first castle here at Red Bay.
As far as my knowledge of this area goes, it was the MacDonalds married into the Bissett family. Is that also the case?
That's correct. As time went on, then 1399 to be precise, John Moore MacDonald, who was the second son of the Lord of the Isles, probably realised that although he was the Tanister, in other words the heir at that stage, that there would be sons born and he wouldn't become the Lord of the Isles. And there had been plenty of connections in any case between the Bissets and the MacDonalds, because the MacDonalds were simply over here in Scotland, and the Bissets were here in Ireland. The distance is very short, as we can see. It's only 16 miles across.
But that was the first sort of formal foothold the MacDonalds got in this area. Would that be the case?
That would be correct. When John Moore married the Bisset heiress, and that, in a sense, established a MacDonald claim to the lordship of the Glens. And the records state that in the middle 1560s, that James MacDonald repaired the castle here, indicating there had been a structure here before. But that didn't last for very long, because a couple of years later, Shane O'Neill made an arrangement, Shane the Proud O'Neill made an arrangement with the English that he would push out these MacDonalds, these Scots. So he left Dungannon with an army, marched the whole way up and marched down Glenariff here, burning the little houses as he came. MacDonald's retreated in front of him. They had lit the signal fires, but the rest of the army from Scotland hadn't arrived in time. So famous name Sorley Boy was in charge here at that stage, and he simply had to retreat. And Shane O'Neill destroyed the castle and the tiny little town that was here as well, Red Bay town.
Shane's arrogance and his mistreatment of the MacDonalds proved to be his own undoing, when he subsequently rose up against the English and was killed in a brawl while trying to enlist the MacDonalds as allies. The castle was restored by the first MacDonald, Earl of Antrim, in 1604, but was finally destroyed by Cromwellian forces some 50 years later. It's been much as you see it today ever since. Across the bay from the castle, which stands above the Red Arch, is what remains of the White Arch, which back in the late 1800s used to carry ore across the road to Carriff Murphy Pier on the Glenariff Mineral Railway, which was the earliest and the highest narrow gauge railway in Ireland. The terrace, as it's simply called, was built originally to house the miners who worked the Glenariff mines. Nearby are the ruins of Ardcleanes Church, said to be the 6th century burial site of St. Magnesi, and the site also in which the famous 12th century Ardcleanes crozier was found. The original is now in the National Museum in Dublin, but an exact replica can be seen in the church of St. Patrick and St. Bridget, situated at the end of Red Bay Beach. The tides of that beach show a tendency to move further up the glen at times, so Waterfoot people appreciate the dunes and the grassy strips that deter them. But they also appreciate the recently provided boardwalk that allows Teresa McGahey and me to enjoy a stroll along the top of the beach. Teresa is a member of the local group that have been campaigning for all sorts of improvements and amenities, including the splendidly appointed new coffee shop to which this pathway eventually leads, and also something in the village itself which particularly pleases Teresa.
A permanent Christmas tree.
A permanent
Christmas tree. There was another place in the village where the young ones used to gather, and we got that sort of cleaned out and planted a Christmas tree.
Right.
So we have a permanent Christmas tree there.
And it's grown every year?
It's grown every year.
Right, okay.
And
there's going to come a time when you can't get the star over the very top, you know? You get a big ladder
get
or
a
something.
cherry picker.
Right, indeed.
And
but you have obvious things like the path.
this here, this is a great thing, this path. Before that, people with wheelchairs couldn't get down, to see the beach even, you know, there were no entrances of any sort.
There was no access to it
No
at all?
access really, other than the access there and at the back of the village.
Right.
And the back of the village one was just a wee narrow path, but you couldn't have really brought wheelchairs down. Now they have made a wooden path down onto the beach, the same as this.
I see.
And,
And you have a beautiful beach here. I mean, it's a big long beach, isn't it?
We have, the local class is a mile from the river
Right.
to a burn over there at the chapel.
A full mile of beach.
There used to be horse racing on the beach in time gone by.
And you told me you used to play hurling
And
on
they
the beach
played hurling
as
on
well.
the beach, that's right.
Presume that's when the tide was out. Is it?
When
Because you couldn't do much out there
no.
now.
When the tide's out, the tide has come in closer in the years gone by. There was a house built down there now about 1932, and they had 2 acres. And there's less of an acre of it.
Was
They are
that,
now
is that just eroding away?
Eroding away,
These wee
dunes.
sort of dunes here are
Yeah.
important then in that case?
They
aren't
are, yes,
Because if it wasn't for them, they would be coming in for
Oh yes,
for you.
there wouldn't be.
I mean, it is a beautiful place, Teresa,
Yes.
for people to visit. Would you appreciate it still even after all of
Yes,
the years?
I would. Because you go away on a holiday and you come back and you come down the glen and it's lovely just to look right down the glen and see. I wouldn't live anywhere else.
You wouldn't have anywhere.
No,
Why
no.
would you?
And a lot of the young people are the same. They will live here, travel to Belfast for work, Ballymena, Larne, but they come back
But they come back
They come
again?
back at night.
So there's a big, strong homing instinct
There
in
is,
people.
yes, there is.
And your own family goes back there a few generations.
A few generations, about 300 or so. Anyway,
What
at least.
would you say? You're not really a Glens
You're not
person.
really a Glens person. You haven't roots in the Glen for going back 300 years.
300 years. And that's the truth, isn't it? There's lots of families here that
Oh, there is.
certainly do.
I can trace it from the roots back generations.